Everyone, welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Dobbin Bandits. I'm Orrin Phillips, and before we start, I just want to say a big shout out to Shane Berryhill for this awesome shirt, the Death Slinger shirt that he sent me. It's one of the best independent comics out there. Make sure you get yours today, Shane. Thank you so much. I told you I'd wear it on air, and here we go. So thank you again. All right, so who do we have on store today? We have someone who has done comic books, televisions, movies. I'm talking about Matt Haley. Matt has done Batman. He's done Superman. He's also worked with Stanley Productions, and he worked with the late Morgan Spurlock on the documentary about Comic-Con. We're going to talk about all that and so much more. So here we go. Here is Mr. Matt Haley.
Well, thanks, Ron. I'm happy to be here.
So let's start at the very, very beginning. How did you first discover
Uh-oh.
comic books?
It's funny. The first comic that I ever read was, I cannot remember the issue number. I should look it up. It was a Dave Cockrum X-Men, Marvel X-Men issue. And I remember that Colossus had been attacked by Deathbird,
Mhm.
and the Starjammers guest starred in that issue. But I was kind of an idiot when I was a child, then as now. And I remember thinking that it was a Japanese comic book, because the way that Dave drew a lot of his characters, they looked Asian.
Mhm.
They had very, very. There was a lot of design, like Wolverine's mask. It looked sort of like a samurai. I think
Mhm.
Sunfire was in the issue. Colossus had sort of a strange costume that was reminiscent of a samurai to a 7-year-old idiot child like myself. And so I loved Japanese animation, even as a little kid. And I thought, oh, this is for me. And I picked it up, and there's Colossus speared through the chest with blood everywhere. And I'm thinking, I don't know about this. But I was hooked by Dave Cockrum's art. And then, of course, I was aware of Spider-Man and Batman and all that stuff. I think I had some of the Neil Adams giant size reprints. So it was probably Dave Cockrum X-Men. Yeah.
So at what point, because I mean, you've worked in a lot of different fields, but at what point did you say to yourself, maybe I'm going to try my hand professionally in the world of comic books?
Actually, I've not worked in a lot of different fields. I wish that were true. I started professionally. My goal was to always be a comic book artist from the time I was, 7 years old. I remember telling my dad, I'm going to draw comics. And he said, well, that's great, son, but you ever think about law school? And he had this whole plan where I was going to go to law school and then run for judge and then eventually become a senator and run for president. He had it all mapped out. But I got my first gig when I was 20 years old, probably a little too young. Excuse me, drawing Star Trek: The Next Generation for DC. I was going to college in Portales, New Mexico. With my roommate Tom Simmons, I ended up becoming his penciler for a number of years. He's a gifted inker, and we did send some samples in. We were living in Portales, going to college. We ended up quitting our jobs, driving to California to the San Diego Comic Con years ago, and showed our samples around. I got hired to do a second set of samples. Old Bob Greenberger, God bless Bob, who is not an editor, I think, in comics anymore. I think he's a teacher now.
Mhm.
Still speaks to me. Can't believe it. Hired me to do a set of classic Trek samples, and then the schedule wasn't going to work out. Somebody hired me to do a 54-page Star Trek: The Next Generation annual. It's annual number 2. Still in print. It's been reprinted for years. It blows me away. And that was my first gig. And I was 20, and I just stayed in comics for a long time. So there haven't been a ton of fields. A lot of them have been sort of comics adjacent. I did a little bit of radio in college. That's about it.
Now, were you a Star Trek guy? Like, did you go in there knowing the characters and all that stuff?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, huge, 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 huge. In fact, years later, I got to know John Frakes, Jonathan Two Takes Frakes. God bless him. One of the best directors in television, man. I got to shadow him when I was first learning about live action television directing. And I brought a copy of the comic that I had done because it's a story about his character, about Riker. And I showed it to him and got him to sign it. He said, wait a second, I think I remember this. I said that there's no way you remember this comic. He goes, no, because back then the actors all had likeness approval. So these poor actors during lunch or break had to sit and look at all the licensed material and approve their likenesses. I don't know if there's a thing anymore. He said, you were the only artist who got my eyes right, because his eyes have a bit of an epicanthic fold. It's kind of tricky to draw. So, well, it's kind of you to say. And so then I shadowed him for months on a show called Leverage, watching him direct television, kind of learn how to do it. Yeah, I was a hardcore Trek guy. I will say that working on Next Gen almost killed my love of Trek because Paramount wouldn't send me any reference. They said, "Well, just watch the show." And I'm like, guys, I got to get the sets right. I got to get the costumes and likeness right. So, but yeah, very much a Trek guy. It was a blast to get to do. It kicked off my career, and I'm very grateful to Bob Greenberger for he probably doesn't appreciate the ulcer that I gave him, but it was many many years ago.
And you mentioned something before about your friend inking you. What for your art in general? What were you looking for in an inker? What kind of inker brought out the best in your pencils?
Well, I don't know. I've struggled with that over the last number of years because I ink my own work these days. A lot of it's digital, but some of it I do by hand. And I've learned that I got to have an inker with a steady hand. My hands shake a little bit, and so that's why digital has been a little easier for me. I wasn't really thinking in terms of what inker is best for my pencils. Tom and I went to college together, um, and I don't have a formal art education. I just sat down and started doing it. My mother was a portrait artist, and she was very good at what she did. And so I'd like to think that that helped, or at least informed my style a little bit. But I don't know that I thought that far ahead. I learned on the job. I mean, for 10 plus years, all through my 20s, I was a comic book artist full time. That's all I did. And so it was just sort of a question of like, I was working with Tom, and I was trying to learn to get faster. I wasn't really very fast. I never did a monthly book. I needed somebody who could handle the faces and the hands really, and Tommy was really really good at that. I've seen some inkers able to work over pencilers. I don't even know if inkers are a thing anymore, but they a good penciler inker combo can really bring the art to life. And I wasn't looking for someone to just trace my art. Tommy might have thought that's what I wanted. And I kept trying to explain to him, no, I really want you to kind of do your own thing, except for the faces, because the faces and the eyes have to be looking in the same direction. Sometimes an inker might have difficulty with that. Gary Martin's book about inking is actually a fantastic place to look when you want to see like what can different inkers do over the same pencil. I was astonished at how vastly different the art can look under various inkers. I've had really good luck with inkers, although it's been a lot of years. But I mean, Tommy was amazing. I just felt bad I couldn't get the pages in fast enough for him. Jerome Moore, who's an old buddy of mine, who's a better artist than I could ever hope to be, to have him ink my work was incredible. Steve Lieber, we did an Iron Man project at Marvel. Steve could draw. And so I would get to a point where, I'm not very good at drawing horses. Oh, no problem. He would just grab a brush and just kind of throw it in there. Shepard Hendricks, Cam Smith, Wade von Grawbadger. I'm sure I'm missing some people. Barb Kailberg. There's been a lot. And I think they've all really been great in their own way. I don't know that I've had plenty of bad coloring jobs, but I don't know that I've ever had a bad inking job. Carl Kiesel, God, he inked me I think on the Batgirl one shot that I did. God, I learned a lot from him, because he can draw as well. And so maybe the one thing that I looked for was an inker who could also draw, but I also didn't want to make the inker's job difficult. And I tried, Gary Martin used to say sometimes he would get pencilers who would really dig the pencil into the page and hope that the inker would just pour ink on the page, wipe off the excess, and just trace. Like, that's not really what you want. You want a really good penciler inker, because I think that to me is the power of comic art. And until a penciler learns to ink their own work, but I'm still a big believer in the penciler inker combo.
Because you're 20 years old at DC, was there like a learning tree there for you? Like, did people take you under their wing, or is it sort of like you had to figure it out as you went along?
Kind of had to figure it out. I mean, again, I felt bad for Bob because I had only done 10 pages of continuity my whole life up to that point. I remember, so he hires me to do 5 pages of classic Trek. And I was a big Trek nerd. It's like, no problem. I got this covered. I'm making sure I have a little, Delta insignia right, and the ears on Spock are the right shape and everything. I'm slavishly watching my VHS collection of classic Trek. And he said, I need this in 5 days. And it was like $80 a page, which at the time was like, holy smokes, you're paying me just to do samples? Those days are long gone. And I was a day late. And it was 2 a.m. I had quit college and gone back home for a couple of months so I could get the samples done before I moved out. And I was freaking out at 2 a.m. going, my career was over. I'll never work in comics. Oh my God. I called him, and he was in New York. I was in New Mexico. And he said, it's okay. It's okay. Just get it in by Friday. And that kind of became the hallmark of my early comics careers. I just could not hit a deadline. I learned how to, but for a while it was like, because the kind of art that I wanted to do, it wasn't that I wasn't working, it's that I didn't have any training. And I was 20 years old. I was a child, I was a baby. I think the comics industry, a lot of times, then as now, can rely on the fact you find a talented youngster. And I was a good artist. My stuff was publishable when I was about 16, but I didn't know anything about the business. I didn't know anything about letting my editor know, okay, I'm going to be late. And so they can handle it in their schedule. I didn't know any of that stuff. There was no job training. I would say Bob sort of took me under his wing, but Bob was really concerned with like just getting his books out on time. So the mentorship didn't come until much later once I was working full time.
I want to talk about some of the different projects you've been on, but for you as an artist, are there books that you can see as sort of growth points or evolution points for you that you're like, okay, I started doing this and it worked, and so I changed my approach this way, and it,
Yeah.
where you are today?
Yeah, yeah. Well, every one of them really. And again, it's not like I did an enormous pile of comics. I miss comics terribly. I just really didn't like the business, and of course now it's on fire. But at the time, Dan Jurgens asked Carl Kiesel and Tommy and I to come and do Tangent Joker, which at the time was DC was trying to create a Harley Quinn that they could own. I guess DC didn't own Harley Quinn, and I guess now they do. And so that was our brief. I had put a bunch of cross-hatching in my work at the time because I kept, I admire artists like my friend Jerry Ordway, and Jerry is really good with the cross-hatching. Neil Adams had cross-hatching all over his work. And so I just kind of grew up assuming that's what you had to do. On the cover for Tangent Joker, I think we were behind because of me. And I decided to, I'm good with the human figure and I love drawing women. And I love drawing flowing fabric and I love drawing hair. And I thought, let me just experiment here and just not do the cross-hatching. And it just clicked. It looked great. So right after that, I think Tommy and I went on to do an Elseworld's Finest, that Supergirl Batgirl graphic novel. And we decided, let's just not have any cross-hatching in the work. And boy, it came together. I started putting it back in a little. I think I did like a Wildcat Justice Society something or other because it felt like it fit for that story. It was kind of gritty, but for the most part, yeah, stuff like that where it's stylistically you realize a lot of the stylistic changes come from I have to get this art in. It didn't occur to me that early on that this deadline. I can't fiddle fart around with this for a year. I got to turn this in so I can get paid and have the book actually come out. I think because I started on a licensed book with Star Trek, it was interesting to then go and draw a traditional superhero thing like when I was working at Dark Horse, as opposed to starting with superheroes and then going and doing licensed work. I think it made me a little more meticulous, a little too meticulous when I was doing the superhero stuff because I was trying to make it feel like the licensed work that I'd done. And I think that I relied a little too heavily on reference, and I started to let go of the reference, the photo reference, as I got further into the work, and just develop my own visual language. Like Jim Lee has a visual language for a human figure, or Gil Kane had a visual language for a human figure. He would just sit, just kind of do it. Mark Silvestri's another artist who had a visual language. This is my version of a human figure, and I kind of had to learn how to do that while staying within the style that I liked. But starting on a licensed book was a very interesting way to move on and do characters that felt naturalistic without a lot of reference. So I mean, every book was a challenge, and every book was a learning experience. It definitely informed my work as I moved into commercial art and then film and TV. I'm really glad I got to do it, but I tell you, that whole period of my life was like getting paid to go to art school. It was really wild, Every day was like, oh well, I better file that away and not make that particular mistake again. I made a lot of mistakes.
Right. Now, I mean, you've had runs on books, but did you like moving around a bit, or would you, if they had said, if you had like a 5, 10 year run on a book, would you have been happy doing that, or did you need to sort of move things around?
Sure. Yeah, I just wasn't fast enough. I just couldn't do a monthly book. It was impossible. I mean, I did miniseries and one shots and specials and covers. And I liked working. I would spend 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week working like a lot of artists, but I just wasn't fast enough. So it was really more a question of where the jobs were coming from. And then the studio that I was in, we were developing comics internally. And, Tommy came up with the idea for Elseworld's Finest. And so then he and I worked on the plot, and it just felt like it made more sense for me to do one shots. And what I wanted to do was the European way of doing comics, where you have a year and you do a big graphic album and have it all come out at once. The monthly comics business just wasn't for me. I just wasn't fast enough. The sad part is I'm fast enough now because I do everything myself. Once I got into the digital space in 1999. I got in really early, saw the writing on the wall. went and bought the first Candy Apple iMac and a copy of Photoshop and a tablet and a scanner, and started getting into it early. Like I got into Clip Studio Paint when it was called Manga Studio, and got trained in Photoshop, got trained in Illustrator. And so now, yeah, I can do a comic no problem, but there's just no way to do it anymore and keep the lights on, you know?
One more question is because you were a young guy, you said a talented young guy that DC brought in. You're working there during sort of the comic boom that's going on. Was there
Yeah.
pressure on you, or did DC look at you guys, young guys, like, okay, Marvel has McFarlane, Liefeld, Jim Lee, stuff like that. We want to groom our own batch of homegrown young talent.
No, no, I got in, like I told you, when Tom and I decided to put samples together, and it actually came from, he had found a copy of the Comics Buyer's Guide. We lived in Portales, New Mexico. There was nothing to do. We had to go drive to Clovis because they had a mall. I mean, there was nothing.
Yeah.
There was no internet, right? And he found a copy of CBG, and it had a gatefold of the San Diego Comic Con. We didn't know such a thing existed. He went, dude, let's get our samples together because the editors that hire artists and writers are at this convention as opposed to mailing it in and having it end up in the slush pile. That's why we went. So we spent a month. I think I put Trek samples together, and we picked Star Trek because we thought if we just do superhero samples, there's tons and tons of superhero artists out there. Everybody's going to be doing Batman samples. Everybody's going to be doing X-Men samples. Let's pick something that's kind of unusual. And I was good with likenesses again because I had done portraits and my mom had done portraits. And so I thought, all right, we'll give that a whirl. So we kind of snuck in the back door. But fortunately, they were also hiring anybody who could hold a pencil the right way. And so, we were able to stay employed for quite a while. And I didn't, I wanted to go ahead and sort of skip the line and get to Marvel or DC, although I enjoyed my time at Dark Horse very much. But there were some fly-by-night companies. There was Innovation. There was Now. There were a few others. First Comics was around, and I really wanted to work for First because Nexus was like my favorite comic, and to this day still is. Never got to work for them. But there were some other fly-by-night companies that I already kind of thought, if we go work for them, I mean, we might get published, but we might not get paid.
Right.
And we're trying to do this for a living. So I just wanted to aim at like the big two because at least I knew the checks wouldn't bounce.
Exactly. Now, you spoke a little bit about working on Elseworlds. How much freedom does DC give you guys on a book like that? Because it's sort of outside of, the mainstream of what they're doing. Were they, they give you guys any kind of parameters, or were you sort of free to do as you wanted?
Well, the way that it worked, I don't know what it's like these days at all, but the way it worked back then is that we just kind of came up with an idea. Like Tommy and I had an idea for a Captain America Superman crossover that we pitched through Mark Waid, which we called Indivisible. And he called me and said, dude, call it the American way. What are you doing? I was young, and he was the expert in that stuff, and I really wasn't. And so he took it out, and I think we were going to do it, and then there was an editorial regime change. It's like Hollywood on a vastly smaller scale. At DC, we had come up with an idea that we thought would work, but we knew that we couldn't write it because we were not known as writers at DC, and so we got in touch with Barbara Kiesel, and she and Carl were old friends of ours. And she had been writing and editing for a long time. She seemed a perfect fit. She came in, gave us a really powerful third act because we had like a premise and we had kind of a plot, but she came in and turned it into like a script that we could work from. Did an incredible job. I'm still really grateful to her for doing that because if I had sat down and tried to write it back then, we never would have gotten done. And so then the three of us, I think, went to New York and just pitched the book. And so it really wasn't a question of like, did they give us freedom or not? It really is a question of, did they think, well, will people buy this? And Joey Cavalieri and Maureen McTeague, who were the editors at the time, went, wow, okay, yes, let's do it. And I feel bad for Joey and Mo because, again, it took me like 9 months to pencil. It was 64 pages or 80 pages, I forget. And every time I've done one of those back in the day, the editors will be tearing their hair out and you'll never work in this town again. And then when the book finally does get done, it'll come out, it'll sell out, it'll sell through, they'll reprint it in trade paperbacks, and then they go, oh crap, we got to work together again. So, it wasn't, I left the business not because I wasn't getting scripts, I just couldn't handle the business itself anymore. But as far as like any freedom or not that they gave us, because it was Elseworlds, they kind of let us do whatever we wanted. And that really let Tommy go wild because he designed most of those characters and he was really steeped he was like Bob Rozakis. He was like steeped in DC lore and really understood the characters. We got to have Firestorm. We got to have Black Orchid. We got to have Jade as a Green Lantern. We got to have Elvis as the president, a lot of those were his ideas. It was really great stuff. I don't remember getting much pushback at all, as long as it was entertaining and we had a story to tell.
Right.
So I don't remember a lot.
And what you guys do is smart because you took characters that were sort of, you know, used at the moment and able to bring them
Yeah.
in and give them new life. And I think that's, you know, it makes a book better when you get to see characters you maybe haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm hoping that Pete Safran and James Gunn are going to do with the DC movies, because they're talking about doing some sort of Elseworlds kind of thing.
Right.
It'd be cool to see them. So DC has such a rich history.
Mhm.
DC takes a lot of flack because their characters are older, and so some of the concepts, like you take Legion of Superheroes. I'm a huge Legion nerd. I love Legion of Superheroes. They have had great difficulty getting it to work since the 90s because the characters just seem kind of old. It's Star Boy and Colossal Boy, and the modern audience doesn't quite understand those characters came from, like, what, the early 1960s, and it can be difficult to hang on to that history without bringing along some of the baggage from that time. But with Elseworlds, yeah, you can kind of do whatever you want. I mean, that's kind of what they did with the Suicide Squad movies. Where let's take some third stringers and have them run around, and we got to see, what was it, the Polka Dot Man in the most recent one was David Desmalkian, and
Mhm.
Peacemaker, whom I liked Peacemaker as a kid. I remember thinking his helmet looked kind of goofy, but they brought him back and he got a TV show that really worked. You know what I mean? So I think that if you've got the right people, and if the people who own the characters, if the corporate structure will let you kind of do your own thing, guidelines are important. As long as you've got some guide rails here and there and you know what lane you're in as far as developing a character, then I think it can work really well.
I want to just ask about Legion because it just seems like talking to people, there's a hardcore group of fans who just love the books, and there's other people who are
Yeah.
like, I tried to get into it, but I couldn't. What is it about Legion that sort of has that sort of division about it?
I don't know. I read Legion in the 70s, and when I first was reading it, I want to say Mike Grell was drawing it. It was many, many years ago, and it felt like it just looked cool. It was science fiction. I loved sci-fi. It was like sci-fi and Star Trek kind of pushed together. I did covers for Legion in the 90s, and I never really got to do a Legion. I think I may have done one Legion backup.
Mhm.
It was probably nostalgia, you know. Again, when Keith Giffen, God rest him, was doing it, and Paul Levitz was writing it for a while, because Paul, I think, came up through like the Legion letter columns in the
Yeah.
60s or something like that. It had such a deep, rich lore. It had such a world that was built around it. And I think one of the powerful things about comic books is that you can have, it's sort of like round robin storytelling, but you're still all playing in the same sandbox. And that sandbox is the world you've created for these characters that has been around for 30 years, 50 years, however long.
Mhm.
And so with the Legion, there's all these different planets. It was very much like Star Trek. You had all these different alien races. Well, it predates Star Trek. In fact, I think the villainous alien race in the Legion, they're called the Khunds,
Mhm.
um, Khund. They predate the Klingons
Right.
by a number of years. And there was some people thought that, well, one of the writers of Star Trek was doing reading comics and, oh, those guys, let's just turn it into the Klingons. Who knows? One kind of fiction feeds another. But I think it's just that the lore is very rich. But I think that people forget it's a commercial business. You got to get people to buy the magazines,
Mhm.
or watch the shows or whatever. And I've seen DC try and try and try to reboot and reboot and reboot the Legion, and I think they maybe lost sight of what made it work. Was like Paul Levitz and then Keith Giffen. I mean, Keith really understood what made the Legion work. I remember when they did the 5 years later run of Legion, where they took the Legion, which was a kid's comic, and grew it up. That was smashing. That was unbelievable. It was like one of Keith's masterworks, and he made it hard science fiction. Um, Including superheroes in any other kind of fictional genre can be tough, because the whole point of Legion, it was the Legion of superheroes. You read those stories and went, well, is there any reason for them to wear skin tight outfits? Everybody on their individual planet has the same ability they have. You just kind of have to roll with it. It's a comic book. It's like when you watch a movie. It's like I just saw Furiosa a couple of days ago, which blew me away.
Mhm.
There's some silly stuff in there. You kind of have to go, it's a movie, just roll with it.
Right.
I think that's one of the bad and also good things about comics. It's like, well, it's a comic book, just roll with it.
Speaking of movies, you worked on the Superman Returns adaptation. Um,
Hmm.
I was saying, was that the same sort of thing as with Star Trek, where you know you had to sort of get make sure everything fits the way it fit on the show and fit in the movie?
Yeah, and once again, they wouldn't. Warner Brothers would not send me any reference. They wanted me to draw 54 pages. They wanted me to adapt a movie. They wouldn't let me watch. They wouldn't send me like timer sheets, anything. They said, "Oh, just surf the internet." I said, Brandon's not been in anything that I'm aware of, and you want me to match his likeness? I had 6 months to draw it. I had to spend 3 of those 6 months just doing character sheets to get actor approval. I had to draw poor Parker Posey. I had to draw her model sheet 5 times to get her to approve it. Now, she did approve it, and she ended up buying the gatefold piece I did for USA Today
Mhm.
to put up in her home, which was very kind of her. And I really thought she would have made a much better Lois Lane, but whatever. Although I'm a Parker Posey stan.
Mhm.
But that, cut into the schedule. And then I had 3 months to do 54 pages of a comic they wouldn't send me any reference for. So it was kind of I had to get my friend Mike Collins to come in and help me do a few pages. And it was a nightmare. I mean, it was an absolute nightmare. That's why I kind of have stayed away from licensed work in comics since. I'd be like, why don't I just go work in the actual movie? You know, the biggest issue has been, I mean, I did a bunch of work on the Justice League movie. It was all marketing, promotional work, and I had the exact same problem. And I finally was on the phone with one of the leads going like, what, could you guys just send me, you want me to draw like Aquaman? What was it? Jason Momoa had that ridiculously
Right.
detailed suit, or what's his name in the Flash outfit. Like, guys, if I don't match what it looks like, you're going to send it back to me anyway. Show me a photo of the costume. So finally I get a PDF one day under extreme reluctance on their part, with my name in giant black letters all over the reference because they were worried I was going to leak it on the internet. Well, I couldn't see the costume. I couldn't see what I was supposed to do. So I try to stay away from that kind of work these days until they, understand that I've got to have the right reference. So yeah, it was the same kind of problem.
Because I would say, because in that one he had the superhero, the Superman suit with almost like the scales on it, so it was a lot different looking than what we'd seen
Yeah.
before. So I'm sure I don't know why they wouldn't send
It's
you
it
a reference for that.
that because they can. I mean, look, I've done a lot of work for giant corporations since I designed brands at Microsoft until the tech layoffs, and it was the same kind of situation. Although Microsoft was actually did give me a lot more latitude, is that they're a giant corporation. The left hand tends to not know what the right hand is doing, and a lot of times you're dealing with someone who's working at the company who does not want to get fired.
Right.
That's all. So you don't take it personally, but you just try to make it clear, guys. If you want this to look right, and I got to get it on model, you do need to show me what the thing looks like. So that's just kind of typical of corporations and how they work.
So
So,
let's jump for a second to Dark Horse. You worked on Ghost, which
mhm.
was, I thought, one of the best books that they had going out at the time.
Yeah.
Because I think,
Eric Luke was a really, really strong writer. Yeah.
man, oh man, it could fit into so many different genres. Like I remember reading, was it Ghost in the Shadow? They did that crossover like that, and I was just, it kind of fits. But so how did you get into Dark Horse? Was it again sending samples, or did they recruit you?
No, I'm trying to remember. Michael Urey, who had been the Superman group editor and then moved to Portland to be the Dark Horse. They were doing a superhero line, and they needed somebody. I think it was Mike and Barbara Kiesel and Ed Martin. Uh, it's been many years ago now, but Michael was running it, and I think Michael had seen a black and white pirate comic I was doing with Steve Englehart called Phantom of Fear City, and I really feel bad for Steve and Ed Via. Richard Howell was the editor in chief, and I wasn't the right person for that because I thought it was going to be like Sandman, and it ended up sort of like a soap opera. Steve and I are still friends to this day,
Mhm.
which was cool to get to work with him, but I wasn't right for that book, so I was begging them to fire me. So I was putting a lot of work into it, but it just wasn't fun to draw. It was people sitting around talking. It just wasn't what I wanted to do. Michael saw it and had a ghost special they were going to do. And Adam Hughes had been the artist of the original little one shot, little 16-page one shot. And he and I both had difficulty just getting stuff done on a regular basis. So we kind of switched off, made similar styles. And so I did the special, and I'm pretty sure Tommy inked it,
Mhm.
and Matt Hollingsworth colored it, did an unbelievable job. And suddenly it was like, it's a beautiful woman with pistols and she's shooting things and there's stuff blowing up, and oh my God, I'm in. And Eric Luke was the writer,
Mhm.
and he turned me on to Hong Kong action films because the first sequence is literally a ripoff of the tea house sequence from Hard Boiled,
Oh,
that
yeah.
John Woo film.
Mhm.
So I got to be the hipster and go, well, I saw that long before anybody else did because Eric shipped me a VHS tape, a bootleg that he somehow got a hold of, and
Mhm.
then now it's become like one of my favorite movies. So I ended up being their artist in residence for a couple of years. I had an office there. I wasn't an employee because my girlfriend at the time was an editor there. And so that was like my social circle. And so I was just there in at Dark Horse. But I learned some very hard lessons about the comics business working there many years ago.
Was it a much different experience at DC than being there as far as, I don't want to say professionalism, but as far as, the business goes?
I'm surprised that comics actually get made. It's just like Hollywood. This is not like a slam. People are going to go, "Oh, this is a slam on me personally." No, I mean, we all were just kind of running around, bumping into each other. There was so much infighting and who didn't like who stole whose parking space. And again, this is many, many, many years ago. I don't even think Dark Horse is the same company as it was. I don't think anybody that I worked with is even there anymore. Same thing with DC. I don't think anybody that's there that I even knew anymore.
Right.
But at DC, since they were in New York, I was just a freelancer and I was just talking to my editor on the phone. At Dark Horse, it was different because they were all my friends and I was there physically, so I could just walk across the street. Here's my pages. I wish I'd stayed longer. I was a child and I needed a humbling experience or two, and I didn't really understand socially how to interact with people in the business world. So I'm sure a lot of it was on me. There was a couple other people who uh, I'll put it this way: comics tends to attract people who maybe are not the most socially adept, extroverted types of people, and that can lead to misunderstandings.
Mhm.
I will say that not my direct editor, but one of the people who was responsible for me inadvertently leaving Dark Horse was a guy named Scott Alley, who has been outed as a completely loathsome human being. I used to kind of blame Mike Mignola for getting kicked out of there. It's actually, I don't think it was Mike's fault at all. I think it was Scott just kind of being a jerk.
Gotcha.
Um, and so wherever he is, I wish him nothing but the worst. Um, but Mike Richardson was great to me, and David Scroggie, who's still a friend of mine, was really great to me and taught me a lot about commitment and sat me down and like, look, do you really want to do this for a living or not? I loved the Dark Horse superhero universe. I really did.
Mhm.
It was silly, but superheroes are silly. Who cares?
Right.
Became friends with Stephen Grant, got to do an issue of X with him. Eric and I are still friends. Was going to do the Ghost Hellboy thing. That was my idea, but then I ended up getting canned, and then immediately went to DC and was making a lot more money. So thanks, fellas. So I think I got Scott Benefield to pencil that. And the Ghost of a Shadow thing, I want to say Ivan Rice penciled that. He has turned into a blisteringly great artist. Holy smokes. And I just came up with that because I was trying to come up with ways to continue drawing Ghost, even though I couldn't do the monthly book because my Ghost issues sold. They sold really well,
Mhm.
you know. And I love the shadow, and it seemed to fit. So yeah, I miss those days. And I mean, if there was a way to go back and do it, sure. But I like checks clearing the bank. And I remember at one point I had to stand on an editor's desk at Dark Horse. They were 45 days late paying me, and I had to threaten to eat all of their office plants until I finally had turned to my work, and I'm like, okay, guys, you do have to pay me at some point.
Right.
But bear in mind, this is a long time ago. I'm sure things are much much better there now.
I want to talk a little bit more about, you're moving on to film and television, but as far as comics goes, for you personally, what was you at your best? What's the one that you look at and you say, you know what, that's what it was?
Elseworld's Finest,
Okay.
Supergirl and Batgirl, the Tangent Joker book as well. God, it's because I look at them and all I see are the mistakes.
Okay.
Um, I actually really liked the Gen 13 comic I did, Science Friction.
Mhm.
It was a one shot. Tommy and I came up with a story. I actually really loved the Gen 13 characters, particularly Fairchild. Um, had a blast doing that one. I don't know. I guess I'd have to. They've all got parts of them that I really like, but I guess I'd have to say that Elseworld's Finest book. I'm pretty proud.
So how does the move come to television, film, directing?
Oh, okay. Well, Craigslist, believe it or not, Craigslist isn't terribly useful anymore. But at the time, that's literally what happened. I quit comics because I was doing a Vampirella one shot
Mhm.
for I can't think of who the editor was, and it was supposed to be like pencil toned, like Jan Acletta's work, very pencil toned and very sort of postery. Well, it took me a week to do a page, and I was an 80-page comic. I want to say Dan Slott was the writer.
Okay.
Super nice guy, but the script was Vampirella wandering around a house for 80 pages finding dead bodies, and I was just like, I don't think I can do this. And I was going through like a divorce, and my life was kind of falling apart, and I wasn't able to make a living, and I thought I just can't do this. And I realized that I had burned out from 20 to 30. I did comic books, and I think again the industry can sometimes count on that. It just there's always somebody behind you going, "Oh my God, I want to draw Superman or whatever." And so I saw an article in the LA Times about this thing called Craigslist, and it was sort of like an online job board, wanted ads kind of thing. And I was in Portland at the time, but I saw, oh, there's one in New York, there's one in LA. Well, that's where there's actual opportunity. And I saw an ad for, because I started in video games, I saw an ad for an agency that needed some comps for box art, and they needed them right away. And I had just put together my first little horrible website. They said, if you do these in 36 hours, you'll get a check on Friday. We didn't even talk money. And I thought, oh, it'll be $200. So I stayed up for 36 hours, got the comps in, check for $2,000 shows up on Friday. And I went, oh, this is very nice. And so I actually started doing freelance video game work, but it was all like boards for the advertising, marketing art, cover art, comps, that kind of thing. And so I stumbled into commercial art through video games. And then when I started working for Stan Lee, I worked for Stan for 12 years off and on. It was a Craigslist ad. So then I set up RSS feeds. Like, wow, there's work out there, and every couple months I would end up getting. It was like I had discovered this ocean of fish where nobody was fishing. You know what I mean? And I would end up getting these really great jobs because people go, "Wow, you're a professional." I was like, I didn't know how to market myself. I had no idea. And so one day I come across an ad where they're shooting a pilot for Stan Lee's Who Wants to Be a Superhero, this competition show. And I had just seen the ad pop up. I sent them a note, and it was a casting notice. But I sent the note, said, well, if you're doing a show about comics, you're probably going to need comics art. Here's my website. An hour later, I get a panicked phone call from the producer. Oh my God, how soon can you be down here? So I came down from Portland, came here to LA, worked on the pilot. They got it sold. We did 2 seasons, and I was the called myself a creative consultant, but I was the illustrator, designed all the stuff, did a bunch of art. And so from there, started doing comic style work for TV and film and video games. Did that for a while. So I kind of stumbled into a niche. So I'm very grateful for the 10 years I had as a comic artist, because again, it's the best training you can get without paying to go to art school. Right. You're thrown in off the deep end and it's just sink or swim. And as a penciler, I had to figure out how to draw everything. And so then from there, I learned the rest of the tools that allowed me to go do comic art. But yeah, it was Craigslist.
Wow. So let's talk a little
Isn't
bit.
That funny?
You got to work with Stan Lee, who's, was Stan Lee all the time? The sort of the gregarious salesman?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So it's not like we were like best friends or anything, because he was Stan Lee, and he was already an elderly gentleman when I met him. And there's a lot of baggage around Stan and what he did or didn't do at Marvel. And you know what? I wasn't there. All I can tell you is that he treated me very well. I didn't get to work with him at Marvel. This is post Marvel. All I can tell you is he was very good to me. Checks cleared the bank. He always paid for lunch, but he was always Stan. He never remembered who I was until like his assistant would say, "Now, Stan, this is Matt Haley. He did the art for Superhero." And we all had our bad Stan Lee impressions. Oh, I remember now. Oh, yes, Matt Haley. He didn't know. But we knew a bunch of people in common. So like, a friend of mine is Ken Johnson, who developed the Incredible Hulk TV show and then the V miniseries in the 80s. Well, Stan and Ken were old friends. And that's what they say about elderly people. They don't remember what they had for lunch, but if you tell them something from 40 years ago, they remember it like it was yesterday. And so I would say, well, Ken Johnson said, "Oh, Ken Johnson." And he would go into this long story about the Incredible Hulk TV show or whatnot. But yeah, he was always Stan. That was his persona. He was married to his wife, Joan, for like 60 years, very much in love. He would be done with a meeting and he'd say, "Well, it's time for Stan to go home and have dinner with his beautiful wife." I was like, that's incredible, or he'd get up in the middle of a meeting and say, "It's time for Stan Lee's nap." He would refer to himself in third person because that was his persona, And so he would go and take a power nap and then come back and, "All right, let's get back to work." The guy was in his mid 80s. He had more energy than all of us combined, So, so I did the superhero show. We did 2 seasons, and then his office kept calling me just on a contract basis to work on stuff. Like I did My friend Morgan Spurlock just passed a couple of days ago, and Morgan and I did the Comic-Con episode 4 movie, and that came through, I think, Stan's office. So it was on a contract basis or anything, but we got to do some fun stuff. Half of it never saw the light of day. It was internal development. I think I did one that was like an octopus superhero or whatever, but it was cool to get to sit and work with Stan. I'll tell you real quick, one funny story about Stan. The only comic book I ever actually did with Stan, most of it was film and TV and video games, was for the National Hockey League, where he took the mascots of the hockey teams and turned them into superheroes, which was his business. It was kind of silly, and I wasn't really a hockey guy, but whatever. So me and a number of other artists, I didn't design the characters. Though I want to say Neil Adams did. So a bunch of us got together, and we were doing comics for like all of the different teams. I did 4 of them. I did the Calgary Flame, I did the Blackhawks, I did the Florida Panthers, and then I did the Ducks because they let us pick. I thought, let me pick the dumbest character I can think of, see if I can make it look cool. I actually had a lot of fun. Well, I think it was the year the NHL had a work stoppage. So I don't even think the comics we all got paid, but I don't think the comics ever came out. But I remember that I wasn't really putting my best foot forward. It's like, oh, hockey superheroes. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm doing this. Whatever. So I just sort of farted it out. I get a phone call 10 o'clock at night on a Tuesday. This is Stan Lee. And Stan had never called me himself.
Right.
I didn't think he knew who I was. He goes, I don't think you're doing the work you're capable of. We're going to sit and go over every single one of you. So for 4.5 hours, I'm on the phone with Stan Lee and he's going over every single panel. Now you see what you did here, and I'm taking notes. I had to go back and redraw them. I didn't get paid twice, but I learned a lot. And so I actually did kind of get to go to Stan Lee comic school, and I'm grateful to him for teaching, for doing that. It made me a better artist and a better storyteller.
And I have to say, your Stanley impersonation, pretty darn good.
We all had, all of us had our horrible Stanley break because he's such an easy guy to impersonate.
You mentioned, and again, I'm so sorry for your loss, but Mr. Spurlock passing. But
Yeah,
worked together on the Comic-Con episode 4, A Fan's Hope. How did that all come together? And what was that like, spotlighting comic fandom?
God, how did I get that? They came to me. I don't remember. Again, I think it came through Stan's office.
Mhm.
Although I remember when I was talking to one of the producers, they weren't aware of any of the TV work I had done with Stan, which I found funny. Like, well, isn't that why you guys reached out? So I'm actually not sure. I just know they contacted me. Morgan was a sweetheart. I don't think we were best friends, although I spoke to him like 6 months ago. I didn't know he was sick.
Mhm.
Let's see. So I did like 80, 80 pieces of art in the movie, did the one sheet, did the logo, was part of it from the beginning.
Yeah.
Not the biggest budget in the world and had great difficulty getting paid, not going to lie. But it wasn't Morgan's fault at all. It was just the structure of the way the movie was put together. And then I go to the premiere with a date. Okay, doing this movie, and there's all these famous people and whatnot. And we're watching for my credit, and my credit is not in the crawl. And I go up to Morgan while he's talking to like Clark Gregg and Stan and somebody else. I'm like, hey, can I talk to you for a second? What's going on here? He made it right. He made sure, because the distributor had taken my signature off of the one sheet, the poster.
Wow.
And so he went and made sure they put my signature back on, made sure my credit was reinserted, and sent me 3 bottles of very good scotch. So I was like, I got nothing bad to say about Morgan Spurlock. You know what I mean? So that's like the same thing with Stan. Like, there's a lot of baggage around Stan. Like, look, I wasn't there. I don't know. He was really good to me. Morgan was really good to me, and we were more than acquaintances, not quite best friends or anything.
Right.
So that was a really interesting experience. That was the one year I didn't go to Comic-Con in San Diego because I was working on that movie. Like, I had never missed San Diego until that one year, and then I ended up like living in Comic-Con for like 6 months working on that movie.
Wow. So, I mean, could you have seen a life where you just did, the art for television movies, or did you have to have the comics to lead you to where this is now?
Yeah, well, because comics is such a good training ground. I mean, it wasn't just about drawing pretty pictures. I was very lucky with the writers that I got to work with. Michael Jan Friedman, Steve, obviously, Eric Luke, Eric really is brilliant. Carl and Barbara, so many of them, and then working with Tommy. Tommy was a really good writer. I hope he does more of it. Learning how to tell a story and learning how to tell a story with pictures. Comics is such a good training ground because it's not movies. It's really got its own narrative demands. But now, I can I've edited most everything that I've directed, all the TV pilots that I did back in the day, because, well, I couldn't afford an editor. So, all right, I'll sit and do it. And as I started editing footage, realized, well, this isn't really any different than laying out a comic book. You've got a moving image as opposed to a still image. But when you juxtapose them, depending on how like if you took a bunch of 3x5 cards and drew an image on each one of them and threw them on the ground and then started moving them around, our minds are natural storytellers. And so you're almost getting the reader or the viewer to help you make the story, which is a trick I'm giving away to everybody else here. And so doing comic books and working with good storytellers, good writers allowed me to then go on and work in film, work in television, work in video games, because I knew how to draw and tell a story with pictures. That's really the most important skill coming out of comic books, is visual storytelling. So yeah, I wouldn't have been able to do nearly as much if I hadn't had that comics background.
When you're directing a pilot, I mean, it must be sort of a nervous thing just to see how this is going to go, whether it's going to get picked up or not. I mean, what's the time frame between when you finish up and when you get yes or no about whether it's going to go forward?
There's there's no way. There's no way to know. I just started doing it for reasons that are not germane to this conversation, but suffice to say, I felt that I was kind of forced into, okay, I better go direct or I'm not going to be here much longer.
Gotcha.
And so I built an ad hoc production in Portland that we still have. I'm in LA, but the production's in Portland. And we just kind of started making stuff. I had a feature I was going to make, and then the recession happened, the money went away. So I thought, well, now I got all these people and I got this stage and all this gear. Let's start making stuff. And so we started making pilots. We sold one, got it on the air. We optioned another one, worked on some shorts, and then the COVID ban hammer came down. And then coming out of that, fortunately, we're staring down the barrel of my first feature, which is terrifying. Sure. So there's no real, like, you have no idea. You make it and you start shopping it. And you kind of see what happens. It's what I like about it is that it's like drawing comics, except I'm working with a bunch of talented people, so I'm not sitting in a room by myself. I used to joke that I'm an extrovert with an introvert's job, and it's very true. I didn't want to quit doing it. I loved my job, but I really needed to get out of the house, and that's really how it started. So
You mentioned before you're a big Nexus fan. If you had an opportunity to get a shot at the character, what would you do? And would you come up with a story, or would you just want to do the art for it?
no, that's Mike and Steve. No. I talked to Steve and I are friends. Steve and Janelle and I are friends now, which is funny because Steve is literally like one of my favorite artists, and Mike is a wild man. So Steve's been doing, I think, his own Nexus stuff.
Yep.
And I remember we were at a con years ago, and finally got to meet him and hang with him. That's where I met him and Janelle. I was like, please let me do like a Nexus Bull-Shaped World story. And I was gonna do it, and then he decided he was going to do it himself. It's that they own that character. I'm content to read Nexus. It's just my favorite comic. So I wouldn't touch it. It's theirs.
Is there a character that you would like to have a crack at?
I mean, I never really got to draw Batman. It was always Batgirl and Supergirl and Wonder Woman and Catwoman. And I love drawing women, but I kept going to the editors at DC back in the day. Come on, let me have a crack at Batman. Like, but you draw such a good Batgirl. Like, well, I appreciate that, but I think at this point my own characters. You know what I mean? I got to draw a bunch of different characters. I didn't get to do as much at Marvel as I would have liked. I'm a big classic X-Men nerd. That's where it all started. But I don't know. I got to do a lot of that stuff. I'm fine. I'm really content working on, we're getting ready to get this feature off the ground, and that's kind of where my head is. And so I've got a slate of things. I've got a character called Cyberfist that I'm desperate to do. That was one of the pilots we optioned. I'd love to do it as a comic book. It's just a question of like, well, I can't sit and do it, for free. I got to keep the lights on. I don't have anybody paying my bills. But yeah, I think at this point, my own characters.
And just because you mentioned it a moment ago, but for other artists out there, drawing the female form, it's not easy. There's very few people who can do it very well. What are some tips, or what is in your mind the best way to do it that it looks organic, it looks like a true woman?
Have female friends. Have female friends. I cannot tell you the number. It's the greatest compliment I've ever gotten as an artist was the number of women who used to come up to me and say, "Oh, you've had a girlfriend." Well, yeah. What do you mean? It's like because you draw women like they really look. You know, women, for example, a lot of women there's a bit of a roundness in the belly,
Mm.
and a lot of male artists are drawing sort of their ideal that they've seen in magazines or whatever, and so they draw them with a very flat stomach, and that's just not how human beings are built. Have female friends. You know what I mean? Do life drawing, draw women, draw your mom, draw your girlfriend, draw your gal pals. It doesn't matter. Have female friends. Look at female artists. Go look at Colleen Duran's work. You know what I mean? Go look at Rez Jaman's work. Go look at I'm blanking on names right now. Raina Telgemeier. You know, I mean, just look at their work and see how women portray themselves. You know, I think that male artists are doing themselves a disservice by simply drawing what they see in Sports Illustrated swimsuit magazines. You know what I mean? Don't use a circle template. Use a French curve, absolutely. But I think in order to draw women well, I think you have to love women, but not love them as objects. You got to love them as people, and you got to see them maybe the way they would like to see themselves. I don't know if that makes any sense, because every woman wants to be beautiful and be thought of as special and desired. And so that was actually what really tripped me up doing comics. I did an issue of Tarzan for a Danish publisher very early in my career. There's only a couple of shots of Jane, and we're not in the jungle. We're like in the modern world. So she's just talking to Tarzan, and there's a panel where she's sort of got her hand up like this, and she's saying something, and she's playing with her hair. I drew that panel for 6 hours, just like, oh, her hair is so beautiful and how delicate her hand is. And I would just fall in love with the drawing. But it had nothing to do with her body. It had to do with her femininity, you know what I mean? And so if I could, I don't hand out advice, but if I had any advice, especially for male artists, just try to draw a woman the way she'd like to see herself. That's the trick. There's no particular like how to draw a woman's body or how the knees are drawn. Hey, that's logistics. I think it's really about trying to embody how a woman might feel about herself, and it works. It works every time. All different body shapes. That is immaterial. That doesn't matter at all.
Right.
You know.
I know there's a lot that you can't say about projects you're working on, but what are some things that maybe fans can look forward to or things you have coming down the pike?
I don't think I have any fans anymore. It's been a long time, and then I'm out of the business. It's a it's a thriller, and it is executive produced by several TV and film producers and writers that everybody knows. I cannot say their names. It hasn't. We have really good executive producers. It is my first feature. I am frankly terrified beyond words, especially with what's happening in Hollywood. Hollywood, it seems like it's trying really hard to burn itself to the ground. I think that the next wave of good film, I'm really hoping, is going to come from the independent scene, like the 70s, where people were just like, MGM was making movies like Lady Chatterley's Lover 3, and like nobody cared. And then the Grindhouse movement came along and saved Hollywood and gave people what they wanted. I'm hoping that we're headed toward a similar situation. We have a decent budget. It's not the biggest budget in the world, but it's more than I've ever had to play with. And it's a very small story. I wrote the screenplay. One of my producers said, "You're never going to get to really get a show going until you've done a feature." I was like, I was too fraidy scared to do a feature. Now, here we are. So I've got great department heads. We have one role left to cast, but everybody else is kind of ready to go. We were going to do it last year, and then the strikes hit. So, all right, well, that's the business.
Right.
But I'm really excited about it. I'm looking forward to it. I've got this. All the people that have arrayed themselves around this feature. It's called Never Leave. It's a female lead thriller. The people that have arrayed themselves around this thing, I just cannot believe the talent that has just showed up. I'm astonished, frankly, because the director is like the entry level role on set. And so what I've tried to do is just surround myself with as many professionals as humanly possible so that I'm the only one who's going to screw up. And so I've kind of made it clear to everybody as we head into pre-production going like, I'm going to make a bunch of newbie mistakes, and I just apologize in advance, and please be patient with me. But a lot of times I'm there to manage the story. I'm not there to yell at people and bark at people and tell them what to do. That's the first ADE, and that's my line producer. But it's more about managing the story and making sure that everybody has okay, here's your piece of the puzzle, and just do that. And that's all okay, that's one less department I got to worry about. And then going into the edit, I'm working with an editor who's got 20 plus years of business. We're friends. We've done a picture before together. We have a similar storytelling style. But it'll be the first time that I'll be sitting cutting footage with another editor. Usually I do it myself.
Right.
And I feel like with something like this, it's important to have someone there who can tell me no. And that's the same thing with all the crowd all around the movie, from pre-production all the way through post. You got to have people to go, yeah, I'm not sure that's telling your story. So I'm excited. I'm terrified. We're waiting on our start date.
We'll
You
go
know,
from
we'll go
there.
from there.
That's awesome. And we are back. Yeah, man, Matt has had an incredible career. I can't wait. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that project he was talking about goes through. I can't wait to see what it is because it sounds like he's very excited about it, and it's really going to be something to see. But could you imagine, working with Stan Lee, doing comics, like all these things he's been a part of? It's kind of like what all of us wish we could do, but Matt's actually doing it. And when this project, I know it's going to go forward, happens, have him back on to talk all about that. So, Matt, thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for watching, listening. Make sure you rate, review, subscribe, and we will see you guys next week.